Maria. How's it going?
It's going okay. I mean, like everything, right? It feels like this is stretched on for such a long time, but this moment, good.
Well, let's start with congratulations. This is, it's been a tough year for everyone, and I think, very well deserved award, the UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Award for you, whose life work really has been about press freedom. And this is definitely going to be the core of our interview, but I actually want to start with just how are you? I think if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that one question makes a whole lot of difference. So yeah, how's it been?
It's hard to answer, right? I mean, it's this is actually a good thing for journalists in the Philippines. And I make no mistake, this isn't really about me as much as also the view of the world of the Duterte administration and how tough it is to be a journalist today in the Philippines, to try to keep doing what we do. This is my 35th year as a journalist. People power. 1986 was when I became a reporter, and kind of like the euphoria of that, that we could do wonderful things, and to be here 35 years later is just heartbreaking. February was the 35th anniversary of the People Power Revolt. So present moment of the past, melancholy, pained because of we have not only the deaths of the coronavirus, but the brutal deaths of the drug war, the number of people, that's the first casualty in our battle for truth. But I think personally, it's more that this is the 5th year. It's tiring, but at the same time, I just come up for air, and I keep looking for hope. And the hope comes, because I just remember why we do what we do. I think that's the big thing for me, at least. When I came under attack as a journalist, and it kind of makes, still part of me gets uncomfortable when someone calls me an activist or a freedom fighter, because I grew up in an age when I used to fly into countries, tell the story the way I see it, and then come out, and you don't feel the repercussions as much as living in the country, right? So you can say and write and show with very little real fear. Well, this has been the 5th year where I truly have to think of worst case scenarios. In less than 2 years, the Philippine government filed 10 arrest warrants against me. I mean,
oh, it's 10. I got 8. The numbers I have are 8 arrest warrants, 2 arrests, and 1 detention. They may be more.
8 arrest warrants was in 2019.
That's
and
true.
Then in 2020, I got my 9th in November. And then my 10th was January this year. And I haven't done anything differently. I know the standards and ethics. I mean, I wrote the standards and ethics manual for 3 other news groups. And I was with CNN when it grew. One of the biggest things that we dealt with was, I don't know if you even remember Operation Tailwind. That was, I was a young reporter then. So I've watched our industry evolve. And I guess when that's such a tough question. I'm still answering the how are you? I am good, fighting for my rights, both as a citizen and as a journalist. I'm not going to willingly, voluntarily give up my rights.
I think what is fascinating, but also in a way terrifying about the picture that you paint is the amount of things that you're up against. And I'm not just referring to the 10 arrest warrants or the constantly living under a threat of being arrested, but it's also, for your job as a journalist, and I guess it goes for all of us as journalists, trying to tell the story as is, there was always a dichotomy of telling the truth to power,
yes,
presenting a counter narrative. And then social media happened, and that kind of has changed the landscape in a way that we're still dealing with. So I want to bring it to the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day. The theme of this conference is information as a public good. And yet we live in a world of misinformation, which is the inaccurate falsehoods, but also disinformation, which is the deliberate spread of falsehoods. And I'm just wondering, as a journalist, what you feel you're up against in your daily struggle. Because yes, of course, the people in power, the traditional power, the strong men of your country, my country, our respective countries around the world, but also the other real power, if you will, those behind the big tech companies, and what that has done to democracies around the world.
What can I tell you? Thank you for asking that question, but because I think that is what's changed, right? So where do I begin? I've always said,
for you personally, let's begin for you personally, for your job, for what you do on a daily basis.
So, when I was with CNN, I ran our conflict. I ran conflict coverage for most of Southeast Asia. The end of almost all the strongman rulers in Southeast Asia, I covered that. The end of 32 years of Suharto in Indonesia, I was lead of that. East Timor, when really actually it was in Indonesia and then East Timor where journalists became targeted, because during that time, before 1998 or 1999, we could kind of be like the Red Cross and walk into conflict and war zones. And if we told people we were journalists, we were relatively safe and in fact welcomed so that we could tell the story. Well, 98, 99, 2000 into Iraq, that's when we became targets, right? And it's not as dangerous as it is today, because today the target is every day, every minute, with you all the time, and very, very personal. So I think today, I should have shut that off. It's actually turned off.
Don't worry about it.
Look, today, I think it is more dangerous to just be on social media than it was when you would go into a war zone, because when you do that, you know exactly where the shooting is coming from. You plan your contingencies, you know your way in, you know your way out. And very rarely do you get surprised when you're with your team, right? And you're there.
The front lines are clear.
Exactly. You know which side is shooting at which side. And even when it's crazy, like let's say, in Indonesia, in Ambon, religious violence, Muslims versus Christians, and they had checkpoints at every different parts of the block. And what we did was to then have one car with two people who were Christian and another car with two people who were Muslim. And depending on who was in the checkpoint, they would lead and carry through. You could do a plan, and you weren't alone. This time around, the target is the only one who sees all of the threat, and it is massive. It's like having a tsunami come at you. In 2016, when we exposed the propaganda machine on Facebook, I was inundated on a per hour basis with 90 hate messages per hour. That was on an average, because there was a certain point where at the beginning, I was trying to respond. And then at a certain point, nobody was listening, right?
Yeah.
So this is personal. The threats are visceral. UNESCO, for World Press Freedom Day, came out with a report. Exactly. It's called The Chilling. It's psychological. It's it plays with your mind for sure. It's mental, and it's physical. So you can see that let me put it this way. The very platforms that deliver the news today are the same platforms that prioritize the spread of hate speech, of lies laced with anger and hate over really boring facts, right? We spend our careers learning how to tell compelling stories built around facts so that people in the public sphere get the information they need, right? But if we just gave people facts, the brain will just reject it and won't care. And you're a good journalist because you know how to tell a good story. Well, think about it as an entire clean slate. It's not about telling a story anymore. It's about telling the most ridiculous, incendiary lies. And the platforms that distribute facts and news will prioritize the spread of that, the reach of that over facts, right? So what's happened? Social media has become a behavior modification system, complete with its micro-targeting. Beyond that, social media also has enabled the rise of these cheap armies that have literally, in plain view, torn our democracies apart. If you look at the top 10 countries where social media delivers the news, it's not a coincidence that they are countries where, except the United States, I think the United States is now after Trump, but they were countries that actually had helped, enabled populist authoritarian style
Yes.
leaders, and many of them use that power to crumble democracy from within with the help of these networks
Which is
that
which,
spread disinformation.
which I think, you know, begs the eternal two questions when we talk about these things. One is, where do you stand as a journalist in that world right now? Because the power, again, you're up against two very powerful, you know, elements. One is docent power, literal power in any country, who use the other type of power, social media, to then propagate. Where do you stand, and where does the work happen? Because again, the thing is, it's relentless, and it develops and it changes all the time. And what's interesting as well, you know, if you see quotes from Mark Zuckerberg, for example, which is part of Facebook's, you know, ethos is to, you know, help people build communities or bring people together. Well, it's become very obvious that that's not happening. But I want to come back to the role of the journalist in all of this, especially because of the noise.
I actually think so. We were the gatekeepers that protected the public sphere, right? We were accountable for doing that for many, many years. And I would peg 2014 was when it really began to change. And
Yeah.
I would look at, you know, what happened in the Ukraine, in Crimea, and kind of the dual realities that were there. And then the rise of instant articles on Facebook, when it enticed news organizations to come into the same system and did not change the algorithms, right? So the very same algorithms that spreads the joke, or, you know, what you had for dinner, are the ones that where news organizations compete. I think you said two things. You know, where do we stand? Look, in 2016, and I really feel I'm so tired of myself because I've been saying this since 2016, right? In 2016, we stood up and said, stop the impunity, and they were two, and you actually pegged both of them. The first is President Duterte and his brutal drug war, the state that is using its power to enable the destruction of our constitution and the death by 1,000 cuts of our democracy, the killings of, according to human rights groups, tens of thousands of people, right? That's one. But the second one was very clear also. The piece that I wrote in 2016, the second title was How Facebook Algorithms Impact Democracy. It's Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. They have to stop the impunity, because in every country around the world, including the United States, including the UK, including Australia, in every country, you see how these cheap armies have infiltrated our information ecosystem, because the gatekeepers, the new ones who have abdicated responsibility technology, have allowed them in. And it's almost like, as we fight coronavirus in the real world, here's a virus of lies. And when these virus of lies, when RT seeds in August 2019 election fraud, and the same thing goes as a meta narrative and pops out of President Trump's mouth after, actually right during the presidential elections, November 2020, you know, this is not a coincidence. This is the same kind of methodology that's happening in the Philippines. So here's the upside for me. What do we do as journalists? Well, for me, in 2016, I realized this was something different. You know, that quote from Conrad, Heart of Darkness, it was terrifying when I realized what was really happening. And this was in 2016, and I began to sound the alarm. And I think many of my colleagues, they're probably too nice, you know, but I remember being in News Lab, in Google, in Mountain View, yes, actually saying, what is happening to us is coming for you, right? And then I wrote, I mean, look, I think people were patient. They didn't quite understand it, because you don't get it until you are the target, until you see it, right? So since I became the target, I'm an investigative journalist, and I run our business. I run the business and the tech in Rappler. It actually allowed me to study it. So at a certain point, I learned to take these attacks and kind of take them apart, right? Let natural language processing take care of it, all of the messages, and then look at the networks that were doing it, the recidivist networks, and to actually point them out to Facebook, to bring them to Facebook. And to Facebook's credit, they did 4 takedowns in the Philippines, including the September takedown last year, where they took down 2 networks of disinformation. One, which we started sounding the alarm at the beginning of the year, was connected to the Philippine police and the military. And they were targeting journalists, human rights activists, opposition politicians, essentially calling them terrorists. In the Philippines, we call it red tagging, right? So they took that network down. President Duterte threatened them, right? So they felt maybe a little fraction of what journalists feel when we speak truth to power, right? So they maintained it. The second one was even scarier because it came from China. This Chinese information operations was targeting all of Southeast Asia and the United States, but it was most effective in the Philippines. And what was it doing here? It was campaigning for the daughter of President Duterte. We have presidential elections next year. Duterte cannot run again, but apparently his daughter is. That's how we do the Chinese influence operation. It was attacking me and Rappler. And it was also essentially sanitizing the reputation of the daughter of Ferdinand Marcos, Amy Marcos, who's a senator today. The other thing it did was to create fake accounts for the US elections using AI generated photos, right? That network was taken down.
So in a way, it sounds to me like you're at Rappler, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're almost doing 2 parallel things. You're doing the news work, which is to bring news and stories to people. That's a day-to-day, but you're also doing investigation of a different kind. You're doing misinformation and disinformation investigations as well, which is really interesting because you see that happening with so many networks at the moment that they almost feel like they need a misinformation or a conspiracy busting, parallel to all of this, because it just feels like providing information is not enough anymore. It's that this is the truth, but also beware that this is happening. And I'm just wondering, and again, I must confess, it's different because, we consume news differently as journalists, but for the general public, this must be overwhelming, but exhausting as well. What do you do with public fatigue? Especially if you're provided an echo chamber where you hear what you want to hear, frankly.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first, the way we dealt. So let me talk about the way we dealt with it in Rappler, and then how I saw our public evolve, how I saw the division happen in plain sight, right? So in Rappler, I was executive editor, meaning I was the top of our editorial chain, right? But I held it up until actually November last year. I gave it up for a lot of reasons. One is, it's time. I'm 57 years old. I'm in a different generation, and
don't look at.
That's. I think President Duterte has given me more gray hair. But so the other reason is also because I can't pretend that I don't know that rights are being violated. I can't pretend that I don't know which officials are lying. I can't pretend. And that is part of kind of the shift in thinking, right? In some ways, old power, and I will put journalists in that, right? We still kind of held on to the old world where we expected power, the people we do stories on, to stick to these unwritten rules that we used to have. They don't. Yeah. They don't, right? So to pretend like it is, it's like the climate deniers. And so I think in that sense, I realized I needed to start speaking. And so I don't get offended anymore when I'm called an activist, because guess what? The other thing I realized was that when facts are being debated, when there are alternative visions, and they're all facts to people in the same society. I mean, talk about the matrix, right?
Absolutely. Especially in a time of a pandemic.
well, at a time when lies kill, right? But I would say when that happens, then journalism is activism, because the facts are not debatable, right? Whether I'm holding a Coke Zero or not is not debatable. But if, and this is where you move into group psychology and you walk into emergent behavior, which is what the social media platforms refuse to bring into the discussion. Individual people behave differently. We can still exercise free will, right? Of course, that's one of the questions I have right now is, with this all the time, can we? But so we exercise free will, but you put us in a small group, we begin to behave differently. And this is like there's so many sociological studies that have shown this. The experiment I remember is that Solomon Asch, where he just, a small group of people come in and they have to choose the shortest line. But the test case is at the end, right? And everyone before him has chosen the longest line, saying it's the shortest. And 75% will follow the group. That's just a small group. Now, think about when you have, what does Facebook have? 3.2 billion or 3.7 if you include.
I was going to say, multiply that by hundreds of millions.
Then you have emergent behavior. And this is what is happening to society. You also add in things like the degrees of separation. In the physical world, we used to have 6 degrees of separation. And that would be the cluster. That would be how fast information can spread, right? These would be social networks. In the virtual world, on social media, that 6 degrees is down to 3.75 on Facebook. It's down to a little bit. Each social media platform has something slightly different, but all significantly lower than what our physical brain and surroundings have enabled, right? So anyway, I guess I'm just saying that that social media platforms are fundamentally changing our behavior.
I just want to pick up on that point, actually. In your work, in your daily work, and in, I would say, the last maybe 4 years, when the real paradigm shift happened, if you will, how did you, in the Philippines, how do you see the behavioral change in the way people get their information? And is it generational?
No. So this is where we really are a petri dish for what is coming your way, because for 6 years in a row now, Filipinos spend the most time online and on social media globally. That's 6 years running, right?
Across the generations.
Across the last 6 years, right? So, and Facebook is essentially, so we have about 109 million population, but about 70% are on the internet. And that 100% of the people on the internet are on Facebook. So Facebook is our internet. And when I met Mark Zuckerberg, I tried to tell him how powerful the platform is, thinking like journalists that he would find that incredible, right? It's very, very humbling to have that much power. Well, I told him at that point it was something like 75% of the people on the internet are on Facebook, and I told him that, and he kind of said, so no, sorry, it's the other way. So at the point I told him 97% of the Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook, and he kind of looked at me and he just said, wait, Maria, where are the other 3%?
I knew that's what he was going to look at. Why is it 100%?
Right. So, well, now it's 100%. So a year later.
But joking aside, I mean, this kind of power that we talk about, I mean, 100%, it's absolute. Like, no one has that kind of power. And I know we're running out of time. I can talk to you for ages. I have 2 last questions. One is, I'm still taken by what you've described in terms of a war zone, that you've compared social media now to a war zone. And I'm just wondering, looking to the next 5 years, the next challenges, how do you see the future of journalism? If someone is getting into journalism now, what would your advice be? What would their best tools be? And what are they getting into?
I love the question. And you know what? Strangely, I am actually hopeful, because this is that moment of creative destruction. I'll finish answering the last question, which is, I studied this, exactly what was going on social media, how we are being manipulated, because that is my foundation for reality, right? Otherwise, if you don't have the data, if you don't understand how we are being manipulated, how we are being, polarized and radicalized, how the design does that, then you would think that we still live in the old world. That's the first. So how do we deal with it? And this is something that's in the pillars of Rappler, right? Because we're actually building for the future. You have to think that everything we knew is destroyed. Like, this is like after the 9/11 attacks. And I'll go even a step further. It's after the atom bomb exploded at the end of World War II. That
Wow.
is that kind of moment globally, right? And so 3 things for me. And they're the 3 pillars of Rappler. Solution comes from tech, journalism, and community, right? Technology. The first is to put guardrails on these extremely powerful platforms that should be beyond profit, right? That should be beyond just that motive. Surveillance capitalism is what Shoshana Zuboff called it in her book, right? And the second thing is what we did as a news organization is we rolled out a platform last year. We built our own because, journalists did something not very smart. We didn't understand the technology in 20, I guess a decade ago, when Facebook came out, when Twitter came out, and we outsourced the most powerful part of what we do, which it's not the content, it's the relationships. So every news group that put a Facebook button or a Twitter button out gave that to someone else. Why do we do that, right? So we built a platform.
Well, relevance, I would say.
It's not relevance as much as why didn't we build it ourselves? Why did we not that, I'm just telling you that I think the future of journalism is intertwined with tech. And several years ago at Facebook, I actually said, guys, you're going to have to get the journalism involved, because if you're not going to protect the public sphere, who will? Well, look at what's happening now, right? It's starting in the United States, but they're bringing in, and they're calling it individual newsletters, which, anyway, let me not go there. So let's say, tech, journalism needs to survive. So in this time period, I sit on the advisory board of many different groups trying to think about the future. But one of them is the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is trying to raise $1 billion a year to help small and medium-sized news organizations, independent news, public interest media to survive this. I keep doing this. That's my code for the valley of death, right? There's a valley of death right now. If we survive this, then we can keep going forward. And then finally, the last part is, look, journalists, sometimes we forget that so let me just put it this way. The elevator pitch of Rappler in 2012 is that we build communities of action, and the food we feed our communities is journalism. These communities of action impact our world. That was how I measured the metric of Rappler, because in the end, I was tired of throwing stories into a black hole. What I wanted is, these stupid idea of technology actually jumpstarting development in a country like the Philippines. And we were able to do that up until 2016. So there is a solution. And the first step is to really, I keep appealing to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, because these now rule our lives. They are the new gatekeepers, and they must take responsibility, because even if they give it to an algorithm, the algorithm was created by them. And it has there's a film called Coded Bias. It has their coded bias. So enlightened self-interest. I'll end it with this. Great quote by an American biologist who studied ants, right? So this is why I like emergent behavior. So he studied ants, and he said that the greatest crisis we're facing, this is E.O. Wilson, he said that we're dealing with Paleolithic emotions. Our brains haven't changed, our emotions. So Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, they're still in the old world, and godlike technology. And I am actually absolutely certain we must find our way forward. And I think this year, next year, they have to be pivotal, because you've already seen the impact from 2016 to today. And when I watched what happened on January 6th on Capitol Hill.
Capitol Hill, yep.
It was not a surprise, right?
Yeah.
But
and also it's this manifestation of what's virtual is real, in its ugliest forms, I guess. If you think this is only happening online, well, it's real. We're running out of time, and I'm sorry for I apologize to those who are recording, because I know we've kind of we've gone over, but I have one last question about power. I mean, your life's work is about standing up to those in power, telling the truth. You've paid a price for that. You continue to pay a price for that. You've witnessed, as you say, world-changing moments. You've witnessed division within your own country among the public. You know, your country is battling not just the drug wars, but I think the ethos of this as well, and with a strong man. I want to end this on the theme of power. And in your work, where do you think power lies now? Do you think it lies with the political power, or do you think it lies with the big four, the tech powers?
You know, I would say power and money, right? That's always been what we have held to account as journalists. It's power and money, and so many of the reasons why the world is the way it is today is because of that. You know, I rail in the Philippines. Why do we accept this? Because it is power and money. The answer is both, right? Like the enabler is technology. It accelerated a trend that had already started, and I would peg the start to 2014 again. In 2014, I saw kind of this nostalgia for strongman rule. In India, Modi was elected. I was covering the Indonesian elections, world's largest Muslim population, right? And there, the former son-in-law of Suharto, Prabowo, almost won. By just a squeak, he almost won, and Jokowi took over. But I could see that in the United States, I could see the world had changed so fast. And this is the irony. When the world changed so fast, I think people wanted someone else to make their decisions. And so that's when you came into this kind of, in the Philippines, I saw it with Marcos, the kind of nostalgia for someone else to make the decision. Technology enabled that. The rise of digital populism, you know, this was always there before, but it is almost unstoppable in the virtual world, given the way the social media platforms are designed and the way they work. So look, I guess we haven't lost our power yet. The fact that you're talking to me means I'm not the sound of one hand clapping yet. It could be, right? I mean, but you know, rail against the dying light. You know, we're going to keep doing our jobs. So we hold power and money to account. And I hope, I guess the
whichever kind of power it is, I guess that's the thing.
It's right now they help each other, right? I mean, even look at, well, anyway, let me not go there because it opens another can of worms. I guess I'll say one thing. I jumped out of the plane. I have a parachute on. I don't know whether it will open. And that's the life I'm living right now. And it's okay, because I know my task in Rappler is to just hold up the sky, absorb the blows so my team can work. And that's working so far. So let's see. We have presidential elections next year. I hope significant changes would have happened both in tech and in journalism, because people are afraid when you have an environment of violence and fear and uncertainty with the pandemic now, right? Fear, uncertainty, isolation. This is perfect for a dictator.
So you're hopeful, though?
Always. I have no choice but to be, you know, I mean, there's no other option. And it's actually quite exciting. You asked me about advice for a young journalist. Guys, go in. This is it. This time matters. I mean, you know, you're not gonna be asked to make coffee like my time when we first came in. This time matters, right? Yeah. You can start now. Do something better than my generation did.
Maria Ressa, thank you so much. And again, congratulations on your UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Award. Very well deserved and great to talk to you.